could he then give that authority to man to say, you have the authority of body? And then I say, this is my body, I have 8 arms.
Welcome to Machinae Ex Deo. Here, we're not interested in building deities and all-powerful things out of the machine world. We're interested in building machines that reflect the divine logos, the machines of God. Here, we're using theology, philosophy, and life experience to figure out how can we honor God with our development and use of technology. We've got 4 others on today to talk about transhumanism. Can we and should we be making or attempting to move beyond human nature? What does that even mean or look like? This is a big topic, so expect a part 2 in the future.
Welcome to Machinae Ex Deo. I'm your host, Thad. I'm a farm kid by birth and a mechanical engineer by trade. Kind of a jack of all trades. I wear many hats. And that's me.
My name's Adam. I am educated in forestry. I'm a Catholic revert. Spent a lot of time away from the church. And then as coming back, now I actually gave up everything and I work for the church. So it's interesting to come from a very scientific topic that my family and I have discussed pretty regularly, and to be able to bring the light of faith into it.
I'm Nathaniel. I have an education in computer science and work in the medical technology realm, and that's about it for me.
I'm John, and I work in a warehouse. And that's about it.
My name's Jackson. I'm currently working in the defense industry as a systems engineer with kind of a focus on cyber, though I am a historian by passion.
We're having a good time here. We're just going to start pontificating on everything. And really what we're asking here is, to what extent does technology augment the human experience? Is there some underlying goal that technology is like pushing us towards, some end? And if there is some natural end of it, is it inherently good? Does it actually reflect God's intent, or is it perhaps even demonic? How can technology impact morality, and can technology help man reflect God's intent for the world? And if so, how? And that's a very pregnant question. And so we've gone a little bit more freeform as we prepared here today. We're just kind of jumping in here. So
I guess one thing we should probably start with is, what is transhumanism? So, earliest, at least in American culture that we see it was in pop culture, especially in science fiction. In the 1980s, became a very prevalent topic with the idea of augmentation to the human nature, typically with the intent of extending life. So we have the question of what is natural to human beings, and how much, when we think about this extent of, is this divinely good? Is this something that we should desire? And at what point does it become distracting and against our own nature? Are we meant to live forever? And if we are, what is it supposed to look like?
Right. You mentioned the 1980s, but when it comes to science fiction, some of the transhumanism stuff that we consider relatively normal, Heinrich Asimov was writing in the straddling the 2 world wars there. And one topic that I was particularly looking at in preparation for this podcast was the human body replacement thing, where it's almost a assumption that some people make that eventually we'll be able to just upload the brain into a computer and exist in a metal shell of some kind, or something to that effect, which is started in as a sci-fi trope.
Which is not really what we're called to. I mean, because we go back to theology of the body, and we very much find that the body is good as it was created. But then there is that strange question that if you really start to push at it, like, what is inherent to the body in that sense? Is it the fact that there's some sort of incarnation, some sort of incarnation? Whether that is an incarnation as bits and bytes in some crazy server rack, or incarnation as a hunter-gatherer who dies at the ripe old age of 25.
Which kind of touches on, I think, what you were sort of saying. Going a while back, I remember talking to my doctor years ago about Adderall, and I remember kind of making the remark, is it a good idea to use, a drug habitually? And his answer was, and this is where it kind of ties into what we're talking about, it depends on if you're using it as an enhancer or if you're using it to actually compensate for the defect. If you're using it to compensate for the defect, that's a completely different thing. So, I mean, like, you know, if you're making arms, you know, prosthetic arms or whatever the word is, to help people who are, like, if someone loses an arm and you're able to create an arm that can do the exact same thing, that's a good thing. I would say where it would get kind of problematic is if you're like, oh, I already have an arm. I'm going to create a machine to make it stronger. Like, I'm going to make myself super strong. And, like, which, well, okay, but it gets tough because even there might be some element of, like, you could do more labor, say, manual labor, if you did have some appliance. Although, if you're literally cutting off your arm to replace it with an arm, then that would probably be problematic. It would definitely be problematic because that's when it's against your nature and you're basically...
You're starting to deny a bit of the creation there.
Yeah, it's almost like when you're taking the body as that is your focus. Like, I'm going to enhance this as opposed to kind of like glorifying the body in a manner of speaking, where you're trying to improve it and make it a pinnacle of something, as opposed to using it as a way to either help others or whatnot, where it's not like self-indulging, I suppose.
Right.
And I suppose we've kind of jumped right into potential problems and potential goods, but when we look at it, we've actually talked about different segments of transhumanism, because oftentimes transhumanism has kind of a threefold view. We can have the idea of extension of life as we know it. I want this body to just exist forever. I want eternal life as I know it. Then we have the principle of the cyborg, that I modify or I augment my reality to make it better. I put on the mechanical arm because I want my arms to be stronger. I want to do more work. I want to be able to be faster or, you know, bulletproof, whatever it happens to be.
Right.
And then, as brought up, is this idea of uploading into the consciousness. Just abolish the thing that dies. So if we acknowledge as an underlying principle that there is a soul, or even just this idea that information can't die. It's an idea. So if I could upload the idea, which is my own person, into some sort of a machine, then I have eternal life. So we have these kind of threefold. Do I want to live like I know it? Do I want to make myself how I want to be? Or do I just abolish the thing that seems like it has the corruption involved in it? This separation of body and soul.
There's something that I'm reminded of here. I believe it's in the book. It's in the book of Genesis, where I'm gonna misquote this so bad. It's right before Noah and his ark, and I remember there being a line about God said, "I can no longer live in man. I can only live in man for 120 years or something akin to that." I'm misquoting it atrociously, but I know that there is a point in that book that talked about God kind of saying, "I cannot live in man for..."
Cannot suffer him to live that long.
Something like that. I know 120 was a specific number, but it reminds me of that, where we're trying to either extend that or bypass that and trying to take matters into our own hands.
Yeah.
But if I can live forever in a mechanical body, does it even matter anymore?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting.
Just to bring in the scripture, this is the beauty of modern technology, which we'll talk about pretty regularly. We have it at our fingertips. Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, "And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. So there's this indication clearly that man cannot live forever in this fallen state from the scriptures.
The number 120, though, seems like...
There's probably some numerology to it.
Yeah.
And we do actually say pretty close. The typical acceptance of science is that the maximum extent of human life is 123 years. This is about where we say at this point no longer can we sustain life. The breakdown of human cells cannot perpetuate without extraordinary means, without some sort of machine to withhold what we call life.
Right.
Then 123 years is about it.
So this is exactly kind of what I was thinking just now, is that, you know, how you say one of the three sort of directions that transhumanism goes being, if I can sort of live in a machine forever, that's really contradictory because you're not even living, you're dead. You have killed yourself, you've supplanted yourself with a machine. It's not you. You are not alive now because you would be, the amount of your being which would have to be integrated, not just integrated, but you would become so diluted if there were elements of your being in that technological that computer or whatever it was, it would basically be diluting you, and you would be a machine, and so you would be so diluted you'd be dead.
Yeah.
You wouldn't
here's,
actually be
here's the
alive.
thing, though, right? I liked when Adam said the splitting of body and soul, where I feel like most people I've met would have said body and mind, because one of the things I was reading about this specifically does call to that, where the soul is the form of the body, the intellect is a power of the soul, and knowledge is good that the intellect seeks. And that's why what John was saying is kind of intuiting here, is that you can't really live in a machine, because when you're talking about yourself, you're not talking about your knowledge. Even if it's possible to have the electrical impulses in your brain copied in such a way that a machine has your memories, yourself is staying in you, because it's not a transfer of knowledge that is happening to live in another body. It's a transfer of your soul into another vessel.
On that point, it's kind of like, I don't know, again, I'm going to misquote this very badly. I heard somewhere that something along the lines of the definition of death is a separation of body and soul. If you're no longer have a body by being fully robotic, then what are you? Like you were saying earlier about, are you actually alive?
So Catechism paragraph 997 indicates that death is the separation of soul and body. So this is the moment when we would say death occurs and judgment is therefore wrought. Personal judgment. This is the particular judgment of each individual. The interesting question becomes, would God allow us to exhibit this power, to separate our soul from our body and somehow prolong the period of judgment? And this is the question that comes up a lot. I had mentioned we talk about this question a lot with my family. And as it has come back to the faith, because our whole family was away from the church for a long period of time, in the book of Revelation, chapter 9, it talks about, and they will cry out for death, and they shall not. They won't be able to. There is this time period that will exist where there is extreme suffering, but they cannot die. So we started to posit, if God allowed, through a permissive will, man to have authority over his own soul and separates his body from his soul and places it into a machine, they will immediately realize that we are sensual creatures, that I don't know what it would be like to exist without a body, because we're a body-soul composite, as the church teaches. Right. So if I have a soul without a body, what would it be like? And once I realize that there's no taking it back, I'm going to cry out to die, and I can't.
So I actually thought of something that in history and mythology is actually very analogous to what I'm now starting to think that might be like. And I will start this as a question. Why is becoming a vampire horrifying?
You have to live forever.
But you have all these, you're stronger than people. You can do magical powers. You can transform into things. Because a vampire is dead. And they're not in heaven. So, what do you think's going to happen to them if they are killed again? You only die once.
That's so interesting.
Because that's kind of the trend you see in vampire stories. Is initially the mythology in that Wallachia, Romania, Transylvania region is they are terrifying things where people will go and exhume graves just to make sure this person is actually dead and in his grave.
Right, exactly.
And in a lot of the stories, they find, well, this person's no longer in his grave. And they have to do something about it.
They're defined, like, even by a lot of people, they're defined as a form of, like, a monstrosity almost.
But then over time, we eventually get to the Twilight movies, where they are instead objects of attraction. And that's because some people's, and I included in this, as the further you get away from even trying to understand the soul and understanding God, that terror of living forever and knowing fully that you are actually damned, you just happen to not be able to end your suffering, that's the main component of what makes the vampire horrifying. And there's a lot of weird inversions with the vampire myth, like the thirst for blood. An eternal thirst for a finite blood of a human, rather than the infinite blood of Christ that does sustain the soul of a person. That kind of thing.
we wanted to go back to Revelation, chapter 9. I'll just read up until the point to give some surrounding context as well. The fifth angel sounded his trumpet, and I saw a star that had fallen from the sky to the earth. The star was given to the key to the shaft of the abyss. When he opened the abyss, smoke rose from it like the smoke from a gigantic furnace. The sun and sky were darkened by the smoke from out the abyss. And out of the smoke locusts came down upon the earth and were given power like that over scorpions of the earth. They were told not to harm the grass of the earth or any plant or tree, but only 4 heads. They were not given power to kill them, but only to torture them for 5 months. And the agony they suffered was like that of the sting of a scorpion when it strikes a man. And during those days, men will seek death, but will not find it. They will long to die, but death will elude them.
Well, and you know what's okay, that is so cool, because now I'm thinking, who is to say we haven't reached that phase already? Because you do see, I mean, that's a very, very common way of thinking is, I want to die, but I can't. You know, and it's not that you can't, but it's that, you know, taking your own life's intimidating. And there's a lot of people in that position. And so there's this element of, while it might not necessarily be a result of technology, it could be. Because again, technology does kind of dilute the enchanted world. It kind of obnubilates, it obscures the enchantment, the sort of mystical, esoteric nature of things. It's a lot more rigid and just...
It reduces it to its nature, effectively.
Technology reduces the world to its nature?
No, in that, like, so if you're going on, like, the evolution of technology, right? So you have... This is a great example. Actually, I'm going to put some personal twist on this. When I was in my high school biology class, probably the most difficult class I went through because the dissections did not sit well with me. There is a point at which you kind of have to contextualize the animals that you're working on as almost like material, like they're dead. They are now material.
Like raw material.
Kind of, yeah, exactly. And you have to internalize that or acknowledge that in some form in order to work on them. Because otherwise there's like almost this barrier that you encounter where it's like, oh, but this is an animal. This is a creation. And this seems to be like this mental block that some people can overcome better than others before taking that step. And this goes for like cadavers and autopsies and all that stuff. But I personally had a really tough time with biology because I couldn't get over that bump, I suppose. So it's almost like the disenchanting you're mentioning is kind of like changing our frame of mind as seeing a lot of the world as just raw material to be molded as opposed to something created, I suppose, in some manner of speaking.
Right, you know, and that reminds me very much of like the abolition of man, and also, of course, Mere Christianity. And C.S. Lewis talks about one of the things, and I've noticed this is very common in, you know, from atheists and such, this argument of, oh, well, that's only this. This phenomenon you're talking about is only, but it's funny because in using the word only, they're degrading raw material, but in effect, they're degrading man. There's this idea of, for example, like I've heard atheists say, like one time, one was saying to me, he's like, so these things that you said that you call revelations, what if that's just neural synapses firing? And I would say, well, and what I said was including that one. Even that is just a neural synapse firing. What's so special? So the point is in other words, if you are to, well, as C.S. Lewis puts it, you can only do so much explaining away before you've explained away explanation. And so, you know, if the rational faculty is just neural synapses, if neural synapses are the instrument of the rational faculty, and you say, oh, well, that could just be neural synapses firing, then you're reducing the rational faculty, therefore you're undermining your own assertion.
We're grounded to stand on anymore,
Yeah.
I think this is the related quote from The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. Quote, perhaps I'm asking possibilities. Perhaps in the nature of things, analytical understanding must always be a basilisk which kills what it sees and only sees by killing. But if the scientists themselves cannot arrest this process before it reaches the common reason and kills that too, then someone else must arrest it. What I most fear is the reply that I am only one more obscurant, that this barrier, like all previous barriers set up against the advance of science, can be safely passed. And that's kind of the idea, again, where if you just keep breaking things down, there doesn't seem to be an end.
And this is where I was getting to what you were saying. What it really is it seems to me that atheists are basically trying to say, oh, we are only raw material, but then also trying to maintain that we have value. They're trying to say they're basically reducing us to just mere raw material. But then the moment that is depressing, it's only depressing because of some, economic system or something like that, or I don't know what the word is, but it's just a self-refuting circle. They want the dearth of moral responsibility that comes along with just being mere material, but then also the value and dignity and respect that would come along with being more than mere material.
It's like everything is raw material, but I am, even though I'm defining myself as raw material, I sit somewhat higher on.
I'm special raw material.
Kind of, yeah, kind of.
Because I'm so smart.
Wicked smart.
So smart.
So smart.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I wish I could remember the heresy. I'm not good at remembering which heresy was which, but in the sense that the physical body is evil, the soul is good.
Oh,
Gnosticism.
So Gnosticism is, the large overarching
Very big
heresy,
umbrella,
right?
Yeah.
But there's one particular where it's this separation of the two, which ignores the aspect of
Is
the
it Cartesian, or is that something different?
Maybe.
I don't know. I don't know if
I don't know if
Cartesian ended up being a heresy or if it's just a philosophy idea.
Yeah,
because they have the mind-body split pretty strong as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So with that example of the atheist, though, that says, like, raw material, but somehow special.
Yeah.
The special thing that they seem to be talking about is, like, the intellect, which we talk about as the mind, and then we could extrapolate to mean the soul, which is the immaterial.
Yeah.
But it creates a dualism. It ignores the fact that we were created as a body-soul composite, not, a soul in a meat sack, or a body that happens to have this weird idea thing in the ether, which was a common philosophy in the pre-Socratics, to have this ether that everything was an idea and then everything else was illusionary. So this, especially because we've been kind of focusing on this idea of separating soul from body so that I can have eternal life, which inherently is true. Like, this is the goal. We want to do that. We want to die so that I can then separate my soul from my body in a short time period, which in fact the scriptures tell us will not be pleasant. But that allows for judgment to occur, and then at the second coming we're reunited with our perfected body and we live forever. So it starts with a good. Like, the idea is separate from the thing that's,
that's degrading,
that I view
over time.
as corruptible, and then live forever. Okay, well that's exactly what we all want. But it ignores the fact that I can't have one without the other.
Yeah.
Our body must exist with our soul, and our soul must exist with our body.
Right.
Again, in Revelation, the souls of the righteous cry out from under the altar. They have yet to be reunited with their perfected bodies. They cry out from the altar, when will you give us vengeance? When will you reunite our souls and our bodies so that we can live in perfection and actually commune once again? Because right now I can't. And this is what we see in the heavenly realm as we wait for the second coming. But this idea of the transhumanist movement of separating soul from body would perpetuate the period of being under the altar, where I'm crying out, God, when will you reunite my soul and my body? But the atheistic idea of, like, that stuff is just crummy and I don't need it. I just want the intellect to live forever. You would have to exist in that forever. And our nature, as a body-soul composite, cannot sustain that. It would be extraordinarily unpleasant.
Right.
I want to play devil's advocate with an idea for a hot minute.
Go ahead,
Going down this exact same line. So, God uses man, and I don't really hold this view, but I'm putting it out there.
Yeah.
Who's to say that the means by which God creates these new bodies isn't like some actual incarnate thing? And that's a big question that comes to mind as we start saying that, I think.
I think there's nothing that says that he can't.
Yeah.
And we see all the way back in Genesis what the enemy meant for evil, God meant for good. So no matter what the tool is that's utilized to allow for the perfected kingdom, for Jerusalem to descend upon the earth and to have the new creation, where all mourning, all tears, and all death are wiped away, whatever tools are used to bring that, God will make sure that it then ends in his good. Because he already knows. He lives in the eternal now. So everything that has happened, is happening, was happening, and ever will happen. He experiences all of it, and he utilizes all of it, his hand actively engaged, so that whatever free will we use, and whatever warped misunderstanding we have of the world and of ourselves, he'll make sure that it winds up being good in the end. So there's nothing that says that he can't utilize this idea of transhumanism and dualism that I desire to destroy my own nature so that he can bring forth the perfected nature.
There's a thing that runs into those, like, should you actually try and move towards that?
I
Which
think
is-
St. Paul would tell us no.
I agree.
Grace
Yeah.
abounds with sin, but that doesn't mean go forth in sin.
I feel like if you were doing that with that in mind, it would be sort of presumptuous, and that way you're
Yeah.
like kind of making the decision for God. Like, I'm gonna choose this path because God will catch me.
Well, that's literally Babel, I suppose.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, so that's kind of what you're getting at.
Oh, that's a fun one when you look at the Hebrew.
Mhm.
Because at Babel, they say that they want to make a name for themselves. In the name, that word for name is actually the word Shem, which is through the lineage of Jesus. You look all the way back and you look at the line through Noah.
Mhm.
Shem is where this travels through, so it is the name. And this is the name that was given by God. But then the people say, I desire to make myself a name. And they say, we will Shem. We're going to usurp this power. God still works with it, though. He just strikes them down. And he says, hold up. You're not going to do this on your own. I am the one in charge here. You
Yes.
cannot make this tower. You cannot build this ziggurat all the way to heaven because I won't allow it. And you can't do it on your own because I'm the only one who sustains your life. So you can't Shem on your own. But he uses it.
Is it kind of almost like they're basically saying, hey, let's curate the Annunciation, the, nativity, the passion, crucifixion, death, resurrection. Like, that's sort of what they're saying when they're saying, let's build this tower to heaven.
Let's build a thing by which we can control how high we get, who gets that high, and it reaches all the way to heaven.
We control
build
our
it.
means of salvation.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah.
And that's almost the undergirding impulse behind at least this first form that we're talking about of separate the soul and the body. We do it on our terms. Because we're going to guarantee that it's done right.
Yeah, that's the...
Yeah.
I mean, that is the unspoken part of it, is like, we're going to guarantee that this is done right. I do not trust God that he's going to resurrect my body the way I want it, so I'm just going to do it myself, damn it.
Yeah, it's a lack of trust, effectively, is what it boils down to.
Which is, in fact, the origin of all sin.
Yeah.
It is interesting, though, that we look at this principle and we focus a lot on the separation of body and soul as the transhumanist movement. Ray Kurzweil is a really common name within this field, and especially in modern times. And they bring forth the aspect of singularity. Singularity typically in the science community means the point in which the technology supersedes the intellect of the creator, which is exactly what you're talking about in the idea that I, the created, know better than my creator, and I know the appropriate way to salvation. So that was what singularity started as. And now the idea of singularity has kind of warped a little bit to say technology will supersede its creator, but then its creator will add on. It'll join the created, which also happens to be a Christian principle of the fact that the created was joined by the creator who became man and then incarnate, makes them perfect. So it's interesting how all of these principles are just warped reflections.
Right. And I was going to say, it's funny, like all these sort of atheistic ideas are funny in two senses. It's that they're simultaneously not at all novel, and secondly misplaced. They're both those things.
Yeah.
So much vestiges of post-Christian
Yeah,
mindset.
it's I don't know. It almost seems to be driven partially by fear, right? Dying is scary, right? No one like you can say we quote unquote want to die, but really it's we want to go to heaven after this is done. I don't think there are very many people who are like, yeah, I want to die right now.
We have a very difficult time
It's
dying.
that's not easy, and it's this idea. Well, while all of my faculties are still working, create something by which I don't have to see myself degrade, because everyone gets old, and so from what I've heard, it's not the most pleasant experience.
Now imagine, though, the idea that I desire to live forever. So in the aspect of the singularity and just the separation of body and soul, I want to live forever with the intellect as I know it now. My intellect is stupid. Like, it's not good, and it's selfish, and it is not oriented towards communal goodness. It is oriented towards what is good for me. And if every intellect is oriented towards what's good for me, well, then you have a self-destruction of the intellect. You would have this computer program that hates itself and just desires to have what's good for each individual. That's not what we desire. That's not at all. It wouldn't work. But the desire is to, and this then spans across all other forms of transhumanism. I desire to know an existence eternally based on the existence I know now, which is not the existence we were actually intended to have. We live in a fallen state. This is when we lean back on the church to understand that at the time of creation, there was original innocence and original justice. Things were ordered appropriately. There isn't that order anymore. Things fall out of order and into chaos. Things break down. This is the entropy that we talk about, and it is constant. So how could I sustain that forever if it constantly is falling apart? I couldn't. And I somehow desire to just sustain this. It's not desirable to live like this forever, but this is kind of the end of transhumanism.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's I have two thoughts on that. One is that maybe it's the idea that once the intellect is separated from the body because of the perception that it's the body that's degrading, especially when you can have the idea of, the professors and scientists and of people who are the best and brightest in their field despite bodies that are aging. That without the limitations of the body, the intellect will somehow become better, right? That's my first thought. And my second thought is actually something that I was thinking of, like when I sometimes feel the appeal of living longer, it's usually in a context of power, right? Mm-hmm. So I like strategy games, personally. And a lot of the wider scale games will let you play, for example, a single country over several hundred years, which one person could never do, even if they were absolute dictator for life. And
only dictator for life.
Dictator for... there are some games that'll span like 600 years of history, and you get to have control over that country for 600 years. That's the only time where it's like, what if I could do this for real? But I know I can't, because I would go insane pretty quickly.
That reminds me a little bit of a thought I had a while ago that is definitely not new. Like, I'm sure this is some other political scientist at some point, or some philosopher has talked about this, but basically, so I think Aquinas kind of touched on this a bit, but so I'm a big fan of like Montesquieu. The separation of powers comes from him, the checks and balances, that's where we get that from, right? And of course, the idea is that with the concentration of powers, you'd only increase the ramifications of the duality of man, in that we're super stupid and super smart, that we're super wicked and also super benevolent, that we're, and so if you concentrate power, you're going to actually, not only are you going to increase the ramifications of that duality, but you're actually going to only augment the baser of them. But drawing from that, it kind of hit me that if tyrannical governments are seeking absolute power, the only way that could actually be attained is that the concentration of the powers must be in the hands of one individual and no other. But that can't happen because even that person they're incapable of doing that, so they need a cabinet. That's a threat already. And sure, they'll do things like, oh, if you betray me, I'll kill you. But you have to remember that things are too dynamic for that system to last so long. At some point, someone is going to get a chance to betray them simply because, again, all the people in that cabinet are basically more or less just as base as this, as the head guy. And so they're really just after his position more or less, or at least when they think they can get it, they'll try. And it is also impossible to create a scenario in which they will never have a shot of potentially getting it, simply because things are just too dynamic. And so then the concentration of powers can actually never be realized, and it will eventually implode. Which is kind of funny, because that sounds semi-Marxian, although Marx had that idea, I think, a little bit misplaced. But it's basically, I think the idea is essentially true, that tyranny must necessarily implode. And that's kind of the same exact thing with this integration of technology and man to such an extent that, like, it erases man, but it doesn't. The integration can never be fully realized, other than with all the people killing themselves before it's realized. But that's the problem, because, like, not killing themselves, is being killed by the integration
by the
of
process.
Man machine. Yeah, by the process. So the process cannot be fully realized, and all the people dying beforehand, but all the people must necessarily die beforehand for the process to be realized.
See, I feel like if it's ever even attempted, the brain not being acknowledged as the soul transferring into the body, the person's going to wake up when the process is done and be like, why am I still in my body?
Right,
and the machine's going to be like, please kill me.
Yeah.
Actually,
that's what I think.
There's actually
Wait,
I couldn't wrap my head around the sci-fi concept of like uploading consciousness. I'm like, well, if you're doing that, it's the whole like there's no soul there. It's part of the soul and whatnot. I could not wrap my mind around that, because I fell in the same conclusion. Like, it just wouldn't work.
Well, I mean, here's the thing, right? Is sometimes the comparison for why like a brain upload into a computer would work is that we know the mechanical process that goes on up here is electrons firing in your neurons. So it's basically electricity. And a computer also runs on electricity. So if we can mimic the electric impulses artificially in the same manner that the brain is, and we make an exact copy of that, well, then maybe we can transfer that.
Yeah.
I'm currently in the camp of maybe we'd be able to transfer knowledge that way, but your self is going to stay.
Well, what I was going to mention is that, let's say if we were to look at the mind as like a purely material thing, right? And it's like, okay, we have these arrangements of atoms and whatnot. Cool. Okay, so what's inspiration then? Because otherwise you would affect it. If it is just material, right? It would be like running sort of like a random function and whatnot. You would have no way to get divine inspiration through like the Holy Spirit and whatnot. That would not be possible. Yet we do. So there is an extra element there that cannot be explained through material means.
So I think you nail a point that we are created in the image and likeness.
Exactly, yeah.
And in the image and likeness, we were created body and soul. So this is the nature that we are intended to exhibit. You also talk about then, there is a time period, and the church teaches us, that the body and soul will be separated.
Right.
I die, and my body is here on earth, and it must decompose and break down until the second coming, until I can be reunited, and it will be unpleasant. So we can separate. Now will God grant us the authority to do it on our own.
Do it on our own. Yeah.
But then that poses the question of, we're talking specifically about upload. In the transhumanist movement, we actually have multiple fields that we can talk about. Upload is one, because that's the basic principle that I must place myself somewhere.
Yep.
If I am then to download, what if God allows for the soul to be separated from the body, for the sole intent of it to be installed again into a body? So in the transhumanist movement is the idea of, I would like to remove this corpus. I don't think that this body suits the needs. I think I could be better. I could be stronger. I could be faster, or for whatever reason. I just want to try on something new. So I take the soul and I separate it from its body, and I experience excruciating pain, like a locust that stings like a scorpion, until a point exists in which I can put it back into a corpus, and now I reunite body-soul composite. I'm back to the nature in which I was originally created. And then you have another aspect of transhumanism where we call a cross-load, so that I could actually experience multiple corpus, and I could be within multiple beings, and then the question becomes, is there fracture? Could the soul experience multiple bodies without essentially going insane?
Can the soul asexually reproduce?
And it becomes because then we think about what is reproduction. Reproduction is when two become one, and then from that one is the divine love, which then bears forth a third person. But if I could actually, if I could actually separate my soul and create multiple beings of myself, what would happen?
You literally just described Voldemort. That's
actually,
the Horcrux.
yeah.
That's what. But that's a definitely.
That is very demonic too.
Yeah,
It's fragmentation.
right. Yeah.
It's so.
I remember the point I was going to make.
I think there would have to be corruption. And this goes straight down to quantum mechanics, actually, and the quantum uncertainty principle, effectively that you cannot perfectly know an object's position and its momentum simultaneously when you go small enough. And so I think that's actually one of the beautiful things. It's like there's mystery kind of baked into the universe. But if you have that sort of inability to predict things, that necessarily means that when you read those bits or bytes or whatnot, I think at least there's definitely fracture at the point of you're going through a person's consciousness. There has to be fracture in reading that because it's so dynamic. You can't just grab a snapshot of it. And even if you do grab a snapshot of it, you've grabbed a snapshot. You've grabbed the delta X. You've grabbed the position. You don't have the momentum. And so there is something about the actual incarnation that is, there's both state and movement in the same token. And I think there is something inherently corrupting about taking a snapshot of a person as they're alive.
So this kind of touches a little bit on and I think we talked about this the other day, because I was thinking we are both the observer and the thing observed. We can self-observe. But if you break down the implications of that question, where you end up is, how can a thing simultaneously be action and matter at the same time? I remember actually mentioning this to a physics professor, and I feel like he didn't like the question. Oddly enough, he was a druid, which is interesting. But anyway.
Okay.
He basically was like, yeah, I mean, you can think of physics as shit and stuff happening to shit. But that's like the thing is the kind of the Thomist question at that point is, how can the shit simultaneously be the shit to which shit is happening to and the shit that is happening to the shit that it is? You know? So,
Perfect.
I feel like the first explanation was clear, but yes.
Oh, that's Thomistic theology for you.
Yeah.
So I think we have really looked deeply into the aspect of transhumanism with the idea of separating soul and body.
Yeah, so we have
So
two others, too.
what
You
if-
still have 2 branches, yeah.
We have also kind of tangentially discussed the fact that through this idea, we don't want to live in this body as we know it forever because it's slowly decomposing. Things are corruptible. Do I really want to extend it perpetually? Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about that. What if instead, though, I could perfect this body? What if I could take and make the recreated nature and do it on my own? What if I could augment creation?
I feel like this falls right into the idea of it was like a thought experiment where if you had 2 people that are perfectly fine and over a number of years you transplanted organs and different pieces of them, at what point are they no longer themselves, basically?
Oh, so Theseus is shit, but with organ transplants?
Yeah. Yeah, it was going along those lines, where it reminds me of if we think of it as artificial enhancement, at what point is it no longer our body? Is it is it a physical quantification? Is it some other way to quantify what happens there? It's a really interesting question.
What do you think?
We'll think about it this way. We already have a little bit of this nowadays for things like prosthetics. We have technology that helps those who are paralyzed to speak and communicate. We have aspects of this already. Most of it is with fixing a defect of some sort or to help put that person back to what they once were. When we're talking about enhancing it beyond what the body was made to be.
So you actually bring up a good distinction as well.
Yeah.
When we try to restore something that we know to be disordered or disformed, then we recognize the nature of original creation and we say this is a good in itself. Let's make the brokenness healed. So this is one way that we look at, especially, cybertronics and looking at the addition of technology to man to make them man again. What if instead then, and this is the other point that you bring up the distinction, what if instead I desire man to be something better than what I had previously seen? 2 arms are awesome, but what if I had 8? What if I were, just a giant brain on a fleshy 8-arm body? I'm a cephalopod. Okay, let's upload ourselves into a mechanical octopus. Or slowly replace parts.
The peak of intelligence.
Right. Slowly
Man is so
replace
smart
parts.
he became octopod.
This is peak, yeah.
So you wind up with that distinction, though, and we see in technology, like you're saying, we have many advancements in technology that allow people who suffer the consequence of some brokenness to then restore what we know to be order. So now, granted, are things like the inability to speak, to have 1 arm, to have, to be blind, are they deformations or are they then uniqueness? And this is actually another form of transhumanism, because this brings us into what they call morphological freedom. That I have in this, we see a lot in society with the idea of autonomy. I can decide what this body should be like. So, and we now see it as very strange ways, and often in mental health situations. I have dysmorphia. I feel as though and I identify as being crippled. So I'm going to choose to have an elective surgery to cripple myself because this is how I identify. And I have the morphological freedom to do so because this is what I desire. Do we have that freedom? Should we have that freedom? And at what extent do we say that freedom should stop?
My gut reaction is that I don't think that's something we should be doing, because it's almost like being you're given a gift. You're given a gift of your body, right? And it's almost like saying thanks, but that's not good enough. I'm going to take this gift and make it into something else. It's like if someone were to give you an action figure. I don't know. You're like, oh, thanks, but I have better uses for these pieces. And you start like taking apart like this action figure in front of your friend who gave you this gift and start putting it together into some other thing. It's like, but this is better. And it's like, it's not an appreciation for what you've been blessed with. And there is a separation there, I feel. That's just my gut reaction.
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely agree. I also would add, though, that it's definitely not even close to feasible. And if it were, because I've thought about this. What's that?
What isn't, to be clear?
Changing your body, to such a degree that you would. Well, I mean, you can have a surgery and change your body, but what's really not feasible, and I would say, even if it were feasible, what would basically happen is, so if you had the ability to snap your fingers and change your body into whatever form you wanted, and it was endless, you would probably start out, every now and then you'd change it and be like, oh, I like this better. And then eventually those changes would be more rapid until eventually you're just constant change, which is a contradiction. So you're not existing.
I'm not sure if I agree constant change is a contradiction. Marcus Aurelius mentions that the only constant is change.
Yeah.
But
there's maybe a difference, though, between that and you being a constant change.
I think that there's the existential nature is the important distinction to that. I recognize that change is perpetual.
right.
But if I lose focus on what was the original, then no longer does it become change, but it actually just becomes the action of change. And I no longer recognize my own person.
Yeah.
It would only be the recognition of the fact that change must occur.
And so, maybe there's different sorts of change. I think what we're actually saying is velocity is not a contradiction. A vehicle can constantly be changing its location. That makes sense. For a vehicle to go from 100 miles an hour north to immediately 200 miles an hour south, that is a contradiction. Or it's, infinite acceleration, infinite jerk, infinite, what are the seven different...
All the forces,
I think the object of your viewing, though, changes too. If I think about the vehicle that's constantly, changing its velocity, if I am constantly changing velocity, that there's no constant, I would eventually forget that I'm a vehicle, and I would only think of the velocity change. And this is where the viewing of your nature would change. If constant change is necessary, and I only view the change as the good, well, change is good, therefore the change of velocity is good, I actually am speed. And I can't be I can't be speed. I would forget that I'm a vehicle.
Yeah.
You just turn to the Flash. It's just what happens.
I am speed.
Yeah.
Speed.
I was actually recently thinking about if you were Flash, think of the money you could make from DoorDash. But anyway,
The food is just annihilated on the way down.
Give it to you cold, you get there and it's cooked. Yeah.
No, but so and I think this is because I kind of thought about this when I was thinking about the transgender movement and how it seems to me to be a war in design, and it's basically saying that nothing has a nature. There is no design to anything. It's basically the Sartrean declaration that existence precedes essence. In other words, meaning I define what I am in every sense. I am the arbiter of my being, and so
complete control.
Yeah, and so, but I think that what happens is, honestly, if that were true, or I should say, the funny thing is, the moment you start to believe that, the moment you believe things don't have a nature, everything gets just super depressing because nothing has a nature anymore, and the infinitude of options is actually depressing. It's not happy. It's the opposite of happiness and joy. It's super depressing because it's all equally meaningless. No change has value, which kind of, I think, ties in there. Change has to have value based on the fact that there are certain changes that are not possible, and based on its incremental nature, too. You eliminate the incremental nature and the value of change goes away, So, which if change was
there has to be rules and boundaries to push against.
Yeah.
Right.
My mind immediately goes to motorsport. You look at auto racing and it's why do they have all these screwy rules and all these weird classes of cars? And it's just wouldn't it be so much cooler if you just built the best car possible? And it's actually not. It's really just how much, you start running into certain other limitations, how much G-force can you make the human body experience?
Restrictions breeds
but
creativity.
the restrictions actually breed creativity because you have something to actually kind of to wrestle with, actually.
Yes,
Yeah, well,
yes.
like,
To react against, to push against, not because you actually want to move the boundary, but because you know that you can push against that boundary and get force and get a reaction out of it almost.
The elimination of a boundary is no longer fulfilling.
Yeah. Like, I have the best game for you. It's on an infinite plane, there's no friction, and it's a vacuum. This is the best game.
Right.
What's the rules? There are no rules.
There are no
Yeah.
rules. 'Cause
Aren't you so enamored by this kind of concept?
the analogy I've always thought of is like you can like chisel or you can chisel or carve like wood or stone, but you can't chisel or carve air. So like that's basically what that is. It's a moot point. It's trying to chisel air.
Yeah.
It's trying to carve air. Or trying to make an air statue with a,
Right.
which would look kind of funny just seeing someone.
I would be
bang
the
away.
best air statue artist you wouldn't believe.
I've
Yeah.
got my next idea for our performance art piece.
Yeah, we'll have some of us play, air instruments in rock bands. Everyone will be blown away.
Live musical.
And then half the other people will be chiseling some air monuments to our glory. It'll be great.
Oh, also, and the thing I was thinking about earlier, because that ties into this, is it seems almost like birth control is kind of the epitome. Contraception is if not the epitome, it's like one of the epitomes, if that makes sense, of what kind of transhumanism. That, like, surpassing your being and kind of, like, electing to be something beyond what you are, but on the basis of what you know through what you are, kind of a thing.
Designer babies, kind of. Where it's like
Well,
it's
that's-
more genetics.
Yeah, that's more eugenics.
That's eugenics, yeah.
Which, well, I feel like they're related. They're
They are,
very
yeah,
they're related.
for sure.
Where it's like real life character creation screen, which is so
knowing the kind of weird stuff people do in character creation screens as it is.
yeah.
Yeah, that's probably not a
Yes, probably.
great idea to release
So I
to
wanna-
anyone.
I want to bring this back a little bit to transhumanism as perfection, and really dig at, like, we've talked about how this seems to be like it can clearly be an abhorrence against nature and against limitation itself in many cases. But like, where do you draw? I mean, where do you draw the line at when we start doing that? Because do you draw it at the very moment that we create a single tool and clothe ourselves so that we don't die against the cold of the night? Everything we do is in some sense I feel like it is trying to get at a form, perfecting the form of human experience. But at what point does that venture into sinful territory? And to me, like, the primal vice seems to be something of pride, or at least a lack of humility, for sure. Maybe is almost the better way to put it, where you aren't sitting back and saying, I will accept this and I will accept my limitation, but if I can at least lessen it, I will.
I think the recognition of the limitation is the important factor, because when we look at things that sustain life, there is the recognition of what the limitation is. I can only naturally live for so long. I would like to avoid any of the things that would cause me to die before I reach that natural point.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing. And this is the building of shelter and clothing and society and agriculture and all of these things that allow us to manipulate the society we live in so that we can sustain life until it reaches its natural end. Then we start to bridge the gap into science fiction, which is no longer fiction, but currently the realm we live in which instead of living to that natural end, I desire to move that natural end. I want it to be elsewhere or to be non-existent. And this is when we have to use, especially ethics, to understand to what end am I doing a thing? Do I desire to completely undo all of creation and create my own new world? Or do I desire to continue a good until it reaches its natural end?
So I think, and that's very much like, if I were to summarize abolition of man in the shortest possible sentence, it would basically be like that the conquest of nature by man would necessitate the conquest of man by man, which if man is going to try to revolutionize creation, he would have to revolutionize himself because he's a part of creation.
Right.
So, that's a challenge,
And I think,
to say the least.
yeah, we sit on this precipice
Yeah.
because we look at things like CRISPR, we look at genetic modification, we look at the ability to remove certain ailments,
Mhm.
to add certain features,
Yeah.
the designer babies, as we talk about. We have this aspect of, forced eugenics, I don't need nature for adaptation. I can force it. And now we get to this point of man says, okay, it's my turn now. I get to make what I think was intended.
Yeah.
And
right.
generally speaking, we're going to be wrong about that.
Yeah.
What we desire is so short of actual perfection that we're going to make, the crazy 13-eyed cephalopod that has a human hand sticking out of the bottom of it. And we're going to go, cute, it's a baby. No, it's not.
I feel like
no, it's not.
yeah. I feel like
and that's where humility comes in.
Yeah. I feel like that basically is the appeal, even if it's not intended. I feel like that's the message, even if it isn't intended, of Resident Evil. I feel like that's kind of the like those really nasty looking creatures. That's kind of what it's getting at.
So I have two thoughts to bring where maybe try and elucidate where the line is, where, when is using technology to deal with, the decaying body we have is good and where does it become bad? Because there's something profoundly beautiful about the acts of healing that we can do with the technology that we've created. I'm reminded of a short video I saw of some device they were testing in the UK that I don't really know how it works. It was like worn across the shoulders, so it's probably got some electronic phase thing that's going on with the person's nervous system. Because the person they were testing it on had some kind of neurodegenerative condition. He had been in the Royal Marines for a number of years. He was already gray-haired. And for their testing, they said, well, can you touch your nose? And if you can ask people to touch their noses, especially if you're listening, and just how simple that is. And his hand was shaking so violently. And it's not just like shaking a lot, like violently shaking in front of his face. That it seemed to me, watching the video, it was less him touching his nose and more him trying to time his hand shaking to not smash himself in the face. And then I asked him, can you take a sip of water? And I was surprised he was able to get it to his lips with how much it was shaking, not just, back and forth further away from you, but also like laterally, like you were trying to tip the cup forward and back the entire time. And they turn the machine on and it becomes completely normal again. And that's, to me, is something that's profoundly beautiful, where there's some interaction with that device and the electrical messages that we know it's electron-based through our nervous system that is allowing that person to continue life before this neurodegenerative thing started happening to him.
So they've restored what was originally intended.
Yeah. And then what you kind of mentioned a little bit facetiously is, sewing 8 arms onto someone. There's something very grotesque about that. And even from a second perspective, we don't remember being babies, right? The age of reason is like 5 years old. But we spend 5 years learning how an arm moving works without having to think arm, rotate 90 degrees. So if you sew 2 more arms, so you attach 1 more arm, like how do you move your 3rd arm? Your brain doesn't know how to do that.
Yeah.
There are no channels. There are no physical channels to do that.
Maxed out your I/O slots.
I mean, well, kind of, but at the same time, just wrapping your head around having body parts. How do you utilize body parts you don't have?
What if I could access? So we often say in human beings, we're actually a single core processor. I have no ability to truly multitask. Our brain is just developed over time to switch very efficiently between tasks. So we're a single core processor. What if I could actually incorporate technology to increase the number of cores? That I could do a task while simultaneously doing another task. Because this actually winds up being the aspect, especially Elon Musk, with the neural net. If I could actually just remove the separation between technology, the access of information, and my body, I could just think a thing, and it is. I desire to know something new, and I think of it, and I have the information. I remove the separation of technology and the brain. So I could have 8 arms, because I increased the number of processors. I could then have my 2 hands that I know how to functionally use, and then I also then tap into technology to say I need more hand usage.
That's still a tool that you need to learn how to use.
Certainly.
Right? And if you're that close to the brain, like, I honestly don't understand that at all. And
Well, we couldn't possibly fathom
Right.
it. It's just like also
It's-
trying to fathom,
Yeah.
eternality. I can't actually, as a finite creature, fathom what it means to be eternal.
like,
Yet I am.
well, actually, I just thought of this. Baby birds, because I currently have a bird's nest on the outside wall of my apartment. And, baby birds aren't really taught how to fly. They're just kind of pushed and prodded and jumped on by their parents until they leap off. And then it just happens, right?
I feel like here we're hitting behaviorism a little bit and like instinct.
Right.
Yeah.
But there's a level of growth that happens even without that chick learning to fly. That still allows them to do that. If you're already an adult, even if you're a teenager, even if your body is still developing, the way I feel like it would have to happen is you would also have to have some kind of, maybe it's a drug, maybe it's something that you are also at the same time stimulating or creating passages in the brain in order to link with whatever your new attachment is. You create those nerve pathway
Right. And I
in
think
your
you,
brain,
you
and that
create it's a good separation between it is natural for the chick to learn how to fly.
yeah.
Its entire body, its members, its function, its, little fledgling feathers, everything was designed for it to fly.
Mhm.
It is our nature to have two arms. I know how to use these things, and I can actually do this very efficiently where I do a thing with my right hand and my left hand at the same time.
Yeah.
It is not to my nature to have 8 of them. So could I manipulate how my brain works? Could I develop the understanding of 8 arms? I'm not sure that we could, because by the understanding of our nature, we can't supersede.
I have a couple thoughts here that are slightly disconnected, but all off the same thing. Firstly, of course, you already have a second processor. Actually, it has 8 other processors in it usually. It's in your pocket, 6 inches long, about half an inch thick, if you got a case on it. We already are walking around. We already are cyborgs. It's a question of how fast. There's an interface. There's always, if we're talking about we put a second processor in, maybe the technical term when we're talking about I/O stuff, the inputs, outputs, the more proper technical term might be a mux. You're taking a few inputs and creating a ton of outputs out of it. That's a mux. You run into bandwidth issues. There's always going to be some sort of interface. I mean, that's why we talk about brain-computer interfaces. There's still an interface. It's not like you're not going to be merging the two. It's still going to be talking at a certain point. There's always a relational aspect of it, and you can't escape that. And like, it seems absurd to me that if you put on this exosuit and you have 8 arms, is that you? Actually, this goes so many different ways.
Yeah,
Hold on a second.
I think calling it an exosuit makes it clear to me that it's not.
Okay,
Yeah.
but I want to go a little further in here too. So, but what is you? Why are you drawing a line right like through 2 millimeters off of your skin, and that's you? Even within that, most of the organisms, or a lot of the organisms, and you do not have your DNA. You have an entire gut microsystem. The idea of the body as this atomic, or maybe atomic isn't the right word, but is this sort of
So you're a symbiosis.
packaged thing. You have a field. Your body is a field, and it constantly bleeds into the world, and the world bleeds into it. There's really, it's a
This
very
is super
difficult.
phenomenological.
Yes,
Yeah,
it actually
yeah,
is.
yeah.
Where's Deacon Roy? Or where's Father Roy?
Yeah,
This is very phenomenological. It's like you're kind of this
Right.
field, and you relate to the things outside of you. And the question to me is, that's unavoidable. So how do you do it healthily?
So one thing I was thinking of to maybe reference this into something that is a little bit easier to comprehend is
Please.
the best swordsmen, right, that have ever been witnessed. That's always been described, or they have explained themselves that they are able to use their sword as if it is an extension of their own body.
Motorsport drivers and many sportsmen say the same thing. Yes.
Right.
Yep. I've been kind of the same thing.
So I think that is kind of the idea you're trying to get at with the exoskeleton with extra arms. Could that be you? But I think where the identity portion of it, what is me, is really ends up being a recognition of the soul. But I'm not sure how to go about this utility. This tool is so familiar to me that it is as if it were my body. I'm not sure where to go with that.
So this is a great thing. So I played a lot of tennis in high school. I still play on and off for a while. I've had a couple years under my belt, and I have the same exact experience where I learn how to use a racket until it becomes an extension of my body. But I never come to a point to say the racket is my body. It's more of, in my mind, it is a tool in which I am proficient in, to the point that it is easier for me to control through experience and knowledge. But I never identify it as part of me, per se. So if you think about it, like, this is actually like a more smaller scale, I guess, form of transhumanism. What happens when someone wields a sword and says, oh, this is my third arm? Or like actually identifies it as such, as opposed to being a tool? At what point, what do you define that as now? As more of like an identity thing, more than just a strict...
I wonder if that wouldn't be like, I had a better word a minute ago, but like a confusion of the brain. Where you said very clearly, yeah, I felt like this was an extension of my body, but it was not part of my... It did not become part of my body.
Right.
Where you're using it to the intuition that you don't think about it the same way you don't think about moving your arm.
Exactly. It's subconscious. Not in that it is part of my identity. It's that there's a difference there for sure.
Okay. I'm going to preface this comment with the fact that I am not a Thomist. I don't understand Aristotelian philosophy to the extent that I probably should as a Catholic. But when you said, I think of the racket as an extension, but I would never say this is my body.
Right.
We're talking about substance. What it is that gives you your nature. It is who you are, existentially speaking. But then I was so drawn when you said, this is not my body, immediately then I think about the option, the capability of God to manipulate substance. Because he then holds up bread and says, this is my body.
Oh!
And he gives it to us. So we see this authority that God has the capability of changing substance. Could he, in this transhumanist idea, could he give us that authority that we, because he already gave that authority to his priesthood, to then say, this is my body, en persona Christi, Christ becomes present in this person, and Christ brings forth the consecration of the Eucharist. He gives this authority to us. Could he then give that authority to man to say, you have the authority of body? And then I say, this is my body, I have 8 arms. At what point does God draw the line to say, no, you shall not shem? I will destroy this tower. Where does it happen? And this is the question of existentialism, where we look at the nature of humanity, in the fact that God gave us so much to say, you have the authority of this. I gave this for you to go forth, to subdue it, to have dominion, to be fruitful and multiply. I gave this to you. Do with it as you will. I'm always going to be here. I'm not a clockwork God. I'm not going to just set it and forget it. This is my design, and it's yours. Where do we draw the line? And this is where we really start to look at the ethics of our decisions. And when we say, no longer can I cross this threshold.
I guess for a clarification, in Genesis, we have God gave us, this is the world, you go and subdue the earth and whatnot. In that line of thinking, is it like, I'm just throwing this out there, I don't actually know, I'm just thinking about it. Is that like the visible world with the exclusion of nature? Like you cannot modify something's nature, it's not within your power? Or is it just a physical, like, you can do what you will with the materials of the earth to be fruitful and multiply? There is, I don't know, it's just something that popped in my mind. Like,
I almost thought subdue sounded there like just analogous to procreation. Synonymous. Like, it's just a poetic word for procreation, subdue.
So God gave Adam authority, though. He brought forth every animal that was created, and he said, name them.
Right.
This is yours. Do with it as you will. And then he says, tend to this garden. What your hands are to work and toil will become real. You will actualize your desire.
Mm-hmm.
So he gave it to us, and he said, it's yours. Now do with it as you see fit. But the further you walk away from me, the more you're going to recognize that it will destroy you.
Right.
The more you try to usurp what is not yours, the more you will recognize that you're not capable of doing this without me. So in transhumanism, have we crossed the line? Have we gotten to the point where we can no longer maintain our identity, where we no longer can be human because we have usurped all authority and said, I desire no longer to be human?
I
So-
think
Go ahead, John.
there is a... Okay, so going back a little bit, because... So I very frequently thought that technological advancements are enhancements and extensions of the faculties. And I think I would kind of agree. I would say that, your glasses are an extension of your vision, but they're not your vision. Or perhaps I might say maybe they are your vision, but they're not you. You think about it, you could go blind and you'd still be you, right? And it's the same thing with, your car. It may be in some sense an extension, but also a reflection of your social life based on the nature of the car. But all these things, these various apparatuses that we employ, are only extensions of us, but not us. However, that it is not improfound to say they're only extensions, to say they're even in being merely extensions of us. That's still a very profound phenomenological statement because it's kind of symbolic. There's this marriage between you and the thing. If you're getting so good with the tennis racket to where you can intuit with the tennis racket the ways to move without thinking about it, you have kind of married this thing. You've almost become one flesh with it in some respects. Although, maybe that contradicts what I was just saying, but you get my point. My point is that they're extensions of the faculties, but they're not you. But beyond that, I would also say that there's a symbolic nature to, because I've noticed, if you examine your car, you'll tend to notice that the maladies and the details of your car, the state that it is in, and the natures of those details, the implications of those details and of those maladies, necessarily reflect symbolically your social life simply because the car is in, one respect very interrelated with your social life. But that doesn't take away from the symbolic nature of things. Then we'd be falling into the category of, like we talked about earlier, of the scientists who say, well, that's only this or this is only that. Mm-hmm. So then there's this element of, which at some point, if you follow that train of logic too far, it does become divination because it becomes symbolically reading the car. But short of that, though, there is still a value because while, you can't know the implication of every detail or everything wrong with your car and say, oh, this is how this ties to my social life, and this is why this is a symbol, say, of my social life, or this is why it's an extension of my social life. You can't know everything. I think, and that's kind of, why Jordan Peterson has such value when he says, keep your house in order, because it's much better to just say, okay, I know my car has something wrong with it. I'll just stay on top of my car, because then you're not reading too far into these. But notwithstanding, even though there are many myriad sort of symbolic implications of these apparatuses we interact with, that are beyond our ability to read, there are a lot that are within our ability to read, where it's kind of very clear that, oh, this is kind of speaking to me as if I were in a dream and I'm reading it symbolically. And this particular malady, the fact that I had to take my car to the shop because the engine blew, may represent the fact that I'm sort of overworking myself. Whereas if I took it to the shop because a tire popped, perhaps this is symbolizing something completely different. I don't know what exactly. And that's exactly my point. We're limited in that respect. But there are certain things that do kind of scream at you. But I'm just going back to my point, which is, wow, I just went on a huge tangent, and I actually kind of brought it back. Going back to my point, where I'm going with all this is that is the implications of what we say when we say this thing is an extension of me. And so even though it's an extension of you, and it is not you, the fact that it's an extension of you is still extremely profound. And to just close this off with one final example, I thought, and this is a very phenomenological thing that I thought a long time ago, is that the food you eat quite literally becomes you. You are what you eat is really not a metaphorical statement, even if we sort of mean it that way. But the proteins, the building blocks of the things you eat become your sinews. They integrate into you. They become you. They don't become your entirety, but they become a part of you, and therefore they do become you. And that's extremely phenomenological and mystical. And that's like the way the world bleeds into us and we bleed into it. And so like the food we eat is not us, right? And these apparatuses that we interact with and that we utilize are not us, but they are an extension of us. And that's not in profound that they're merely an extension of us. So yeah, that's my whole lecture.
It's interesting that you mention that because with the whole like eating and that becoming part of you, when you're receiving communion in the Eucharist and whatnot, that actually legitimately becomes part of you.
Right. Well, and that would kind of mean to me when you receive the host, and that is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, Christ's sinews become your sinews. Would that be accurate to say? Like, literally his...
You truly, and many of the saints have talked about this, and even, so I think St. Catherine of Siena is a prime example of this complete devotion and self-gift to Christ. That her heart was literally taken from her chest, and his heart placed in hers.
Right.
And yeah, when we talk about becoming unified with the body of Christ, this isn't just a spiritual nicety that we talk about, like, oh yeah, we're in a community and, you know, we like one another. No, you literally become his digits. You become his limbs. You become his heart, truly and wholly. And this is where phenomenology, this study of experiential nature, affecting the nature of the one who has experienced.
Right.
And when you describe the symbolism of the thing representing the person, this is voicing the observer effect. That my partaking in a thing impacts its existence because I have partaken. I have complete dominion by his creation, tying back into Genesis. I just have to experience a thing and it changes because it has partaken in me and I in it. And when we see what our nature is actually designed for, our nature is designed for perfect communion. We talk about the impassibility of Christ in his resurrected, perfected form. He has complete control over his entire form, his faculties, and all the physical nature around him. He can pass through walls, lock doors. He can speak. He can show that he knows what we think. This perfect representation of, I only need to experience, and things happen. And if we can do this in complete perfection and unity, then the world is perfect. This is the New Jerusalem.
I'm not sure we got to the I'm not sure we got to the question of should we, if God does give us the, or I don't what was the question? Can God gives us the authority to do with our bodies what we will?
Right.
But that was all very nice.
Well, you think about it, he gives us authority to abuse our bodies in the sense that we can. It's not right, we shouldn't, but we have the free will to choose to abuse our bodies.
And this is a question unanswerable. This is truly the...
Yeah, knowing the will of God.
Soteriology.
Right.
This is when the church sits here and looks at all things. At what point do we say, I know? Well, rarely can we ever say, I know. We can be enlightened. And more often than not, the more we philosophize, the more we come up with these ideas, the less we truly understand. We will look to the world and say, I have changed my understanding of that tree outside the window, but I don't understand it. I don't know why God created it. I don't know why. I don't understand my impact on it. The fact that I observed it, the fact that Christ walks by the fig tree and kills it. What does this have to do with my creation? I don't know. It's contemplation. I will forever live in this contemplation until he eventually reveals it to us.
And even more than contemplation, I think the right word is relation. Like, so if it's all phenomenological, if everything is fields that just interact with each other, the question is, are they interacting with each other healthily? Are they in right relation with each other? Would any 8 arms that we add with each other put us in better relationship with those around us, but more importantly with God? Would 8 arms put me in better relationship with that tree across the street?
I mean, just imagine 2 8-armed people giving each other a hug. That would be so weird, dude.
Or like, I'm 300% more arms.
I'm picturing, it's funny
better.
because when you said like relation and then like 8 arms, and I just started thinking like 2 people in a relationship holding hands but with 8 arms. It's like they're like holding 4 arms each, the other 4 just hanging on the other side. Like, that'd be weird.
Just interlaced.
So I think, though,
Spiders.
we cannot answer with absolute certainty where the line is.
Right.
We must constantly look to the church to say, what is the nature of our existence? What is our end, which has been revealed to us? And what things along the way guide us toward that end, and what things along the way guide us away from that end. And we have two spirits to discern, the spirit of truth and then the spirit of the evil one. One will guide us towards confidence, one will guide us towards unity, one will guide us towards true communion, and one will guide us towards our own distinct desires, our own independence, and our own usurping of authority. But we will desire it as a good, and we must discern this along the way.
Yeah, I was thinking more along the where you mentioned in Genesis, where God creates everything on the earth, then creates Adam, and says, you can go name these, right? And things you toil, you'll get something out of it. But naming something is more along the lines of recognizing what it is, and that's the authority given by God in that passage. And naming something is different than altering it.
So there's an interesting Hebraism that exists too, especially when we look at things in the American nomenclature, when we look at the translations, when we look at our culture, we sometimes lose things. The name, the Shem, actually holds its authority. If I name a thing, it's mine. This is why we are never to name our guardians, because they are not mine by my authority. They are gifted to me. Do not ever name your guardian, because something will present itself by that name and it will likely not be your guardian. So when Adam names them, he has authority over them. They are his. They belong to him because he gave them that name. Right. Now, there are certain things that we cannot give names, like our guardians. We do not have authority over them. But the created world, Adam named everything. The plants are his. The animals are his. The birds of the sky, the creeping things on the earth are all his. He has authority over this. He even named his wife. He has authority. Man has authority of the created world. So at what point then do we say, I can manipulate the thing in which I have authority over?
Yeah, because that's the kind of question that follows that, is how much does a thing change before you need a new name for it?
That's a good point.
Right. Well, and that's why, in the Bible, repeatedly God will change someone's name when he gives them a new mission. Mm-hmm. The name is kind of the mission. It's kind of it's the identity.
Right.
So, yeah.
And that's the symbolic part of confirmation as well, while you're taking on a new name.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not only an intercessor, but one whom you desire to be more like, because you have now changed. The Spirit has descended upon you, completed the graces that were imparted upon you in baptism, that you may go forth and proclaim the gospel. So you do change. There is this ontological nature that no longer are you solely your previous name, but you are your previous name on top of now all of the things which you have taken on. Which is interesting, why sometimes I was far from the church when I was confirmed. It was more of a placation to my parents. But I chose the name Wenceslas. Good King Wenceslas. And at the time, I was like, I just want to find the name that no one else is going to have because I want to be different. But Good King Wenceslas had this affinity and love for the poor. And at that time in my life, I was very self-centered, very independent. I wanted to be off in the woods, by myself, no interaction with people. But I took on that name. I changed. And then slowly over time, God revealed to me what that change actually meant. And he called me out of the woods of independence. And he called me into the streets, that I was to dwell with the poor. So this changes us. And the name means something. So when Adam has that authority to name, things change. The world now revolves around the one who named them. Can I change my name in transhumanism?
Actually, that's a question, though, right? The authority lies in the one who did the naming. But even though Adam gets to name the creatures of the earth, God names Adam, does he not?
Yes.
Although I wonder, I'm assuming the Catholic Church doesn't have anything against, well, maybe this is more for post, but I'm assuming the Catholic Church doesn't have any teaching where you can't change your name if you didn't want to. Right? You could probably change your name.
You mean your legal authority of a name?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's nothing against it, no.
Yeah.
Name, though, meaning something about identity. Yeah. Not simply, because we also, as Americans, have this idea of proper nouns that you are Jonathan and I am Adam. We have this idea of this is an identifier, but not an identity. Whereas, especially in Hebraic cultures, in Semitic cultures, the name was the identity. So Jacob was named Jacob. Oh, I'm going to screw this one up. Yes, Jacob was because Sarah laughed. So it is. No, that's Isaac, isn't it?
So it's-
I don't
I thought
know.
Isaac was the one that was like a donkey or something, or is that?
I'll screw up all these.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Yeah.
the name was actually a title. I'll use ones that we all know. Michael, who is like God, as a
Yeah.
question, is an
Right.
indicator of titleifically proclaiming no one is like God. God is like God.
Yep.
Raphael, the healer of God.
Yeah.
Gabriel, the messenger of God.
Mhm.
It's actually a title of who they are as identity,
Mhm.
and I gave the name to represent that identity.
Mhm.
Where we don't really do that anymore. We don't have these titleific names.
It sounds nice.
Yeah.
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 Now,
Yeah, I mean, the Native Americans did kind of the same thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
I think the difficulty is it's hard because you don't know what that kid's going to be like. It's like, how am I going to name them something that's like,
Okay.
Now, at what point does the name start
Influence
to
the
manipulate
person.
and influence?
Yeah.
Right,
What
right,
the
yeah.
person will be like.
yeah.
Minor theory. Does Hebrew have tenses and word endings?
Is it
declensions
inflected?
and conjugations?
Is it an inflected language?
Is that what? Is
Well,
it declined or conjugated? Is that inflected?
I
So
thought decline to do
you
with
do
nouns
both
and
of those.
conjugation.
So conjugation is a verb, so that's why it's I do something, you do something, he does something, they do something.
Yeah.
You can have the same verb written 4 different ways to mean that without any helper words.
Anyways,
But
it's either
inflected is more with the nouns, with your nouns and adjectives, where they don't necessarily they shape the adjectives that are referring to a noun share the same ending. Greek is inflected, Latin is inflected.
Yep.
German is like semi-inflected nowadays. It's kind of weird. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. English is not inflected.
Yep.
You only know that an adjective is referring to a noun because of their proximity, and that's about it.
Like you're thinking about like future, past, future, present tense in Hebrew. So you're thinking about.
Like, do they actually modify words to reflect their usage?
I'll preface that I am not a linguist.
We might get this.
But when you look at concordances and you look at interlinears, it does indicate their tenses. So it does have some sense at least. But Hebrew especially has this play on words where things that sound similar mean different things, but they are directly interlinked. So Adam, man, was formed from Adama, soil, clay. So God formed clay, and then He breathed. He had this. The Hebrew word is pneuma. No, ruah. Greek is pneuma. He has this ruah. He breathes into clay, and clay becomes man. So the words have the same root, but they actually mean different things. Adama and Adam, same root, but mean two very different things: clay and man. So they have these interplays. And then when we look at, oh, shucks, I was just looking at this from recently. Man and woman. I'll have to think about that one later. We'll put it in the comments.
Yeah.
But they have these interplays on words that a thing is a direct result of another thing, and the words have a similarity. But they do have the conjugation and the function that there is tense. There is change in the word based on how I intend the word to be used. I am not a linguist, though, so I speak with zero authority.
That's funny because it reminds me of when I read when I was doing the Odyssey in Greek in high school, because the word that Odysseus gives as his name to Polyphemus, it always gets translated as nobody, because that's literally the word he's using. But the way he's saying it would be more like in English saying, my name is Nuna, so no one, but smashed together. And when you do that, the way Homer composed the Odyssey, it's the word for intelligence, but with an accent on the wrong syllable.
Oh.
So Polyphemus is shouting, help, help, intelligence is killing me. And all the other cyclopes are like, well, we can't help you with that. You're going to have to pray to your dad. Or how napioi, which is the word used to describe Odysseus' crewmen, means fools. That's how it's translated. But it's new to words. They're fools like children are fools.
I absolutely love the word pneuma because that's the word I use when I think of it. Almost, I think, supplants nuances quite sufficiently. When I'm, again, like my whole thing about nature and you look and there's all these nuances, I really want to describe it as everything has a distinct pneuma that kind of characterizes it. And again, like this is technology has kind of obnubulated that. It obnubulates the pneuma of the thing.
And that's exactly
like-
what we're talking about next time.
Oh no.
We are talking about, can we make technology that preserves or even makes clear the numinosity we find within the world?
Can technology be numinous? Can it be mystical?
That is the question.
Yeah.
Because it really seems like no, very few.
Yeah, it kind of does. Like,
But is there a way out? That's what we're going to try and figure out next time on Machinae Ex Deo.